In this chapter, we're going to be going over Vray Proxies. The idea of a Vray proxy is that it is a ready-to-render mesh that can live on your hard drive instead of living inside of your Maya scene. They're very effective, and now in version 3 of Vray, they can also accept the Alembic format, which is awesome because it can store instance data and also other kinds of information that come from other packages like Houdini or Softimage or 3D Studio, taking advantage of the Alembic format. You may remember this scene was something that we were using in the subsurface scattering demo. I opened it up because it has some really dense meshes inside. You can see right now my total face count is 900,000. And I just wanted to have something pretty dense just to really show the power of these Vray proxies. Another one of the main ideas of the Vray proxy is that they only will ever be called one time. So when you hit the render button and these 3 meshes pop in, you can have basically unlimited copies of that VR mesh file in your Maya file. Well, not unlimited, but wherever Maya would kind of cap out. But you can basically create unlimited counts of geometry. And that's in this first demo here, that's kind of, we're going to be showing an example of that. But first, let's talk about how to export our Vray proxy. So in our little demo scene here, you can see that we do have, so we got 2 liquid meshes with a shader assigned. I'm actually going to assign a different shader to this object right here. So I'm just going to assign a Vray material, and we'll just make that kind of a metal material on that guy. So we'll just set the reflection color up, turn off our turn on our Fresnel, turn off the lock, and we'll lower that reflection glossiness. It's kind of a nice brushed metal. And we'll set it to the GGX reflection type. Cool. So what we're going to do first, select both of these meshes, and let's take a look at our outliner here. So that's our light source. We've got a camera, and then we've got our liquid right here. So I can either select the liquid group node or I can select the meshes. Either one is fine. And the way we're going to get to the Vray proxy creation menu, or in other words, export this proxy to disk, is right here under Create Vray. We can say Create Proxy. Popped up on my other monitor. Here we go. So this menu will come up and give you a lot of options to how your proxy is going to be exported. So if we look at this, you can see we've got first the path where this is going to go. So let's go ahead and change that. I'm just going to make a proxies folder, and we will go ahead and export this. So we'll just call this liquid proxy version 1. There we go, version 1. Oh, sorry. This is only the folder. So I'm just going to place this right here into the folder. And then right below here, we're going to actually name our mesh. So I'm just going to call this liquid proxy version 1.VR mesh. You can see right here, we have some more options. We can see it has export all to a single file, which is what I want to do in this case. You can also export animation. You can actually utilize this Create Vray proxy menu to export deforming meshes. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff with it. It definitely is a slow process to bake all of that out, but you can utilize it in that way. You can see if I turn that on, you have options on how to deal with motion blur. You can specify the exact frame range, all of that good stuff. So I'm going to turn off the export animation for now. And down here, you can see this says faces in preview. What that means is Vray is going to create a decimated mesh that represent where these objects are. And there's also going to be, you can see right here, the preview type refined clustering for quality. I don't actually remember if this is the default or not, because I use Vray a lot on my machine here. But what this is going to, this is a new feature, and this will give you a pretty nice looking mesh. Before, if you're on V-Ray 2.4, you might just get little triangles that are floating across the mesh. So cool. So you can see that we've got 10,000 faces in our preview, and the last checkbox is this automatically create proxies. Now I'm going to turn this on, and what this is going to do is actually import the proxy into my Maya scene, and it's going to go ahead and connect the shaders that I currently have assigned to the V-Ray proxy itself. One quick thing to note, let me open up my node editor here. V-Ray is going to grab the names of the shaders that are connected to the proxy. So if I go in, and I do want to name these, so I'm going to name, so we'll just call this blue SSS matte, and I'm going to name my shading group as well. So we'll call that blue SSS shading group. And then this is just going to be our metal matte. And lastly, name the shading group. There we go, cool. So that'll just ensure that our proxy is going to be named correctly. And actually, because I just deselected that, kind of messed this up. So we'll call this liquid proxy version 1. Again, cool. That naming of your shaders is definitely an important step, and you'll see why in 1 second. So let's go ahead and create this. Double check all my settings. Everything looks good. Create proxy. Now, this is thinking. You can see if I bring up my output window here, this is saving out all of the mesh information. You can see it's doing normals, UVs, all of that. And cool. Export complete. So you can close this menu now, and you can see we've got I actually think that I forgot a mesh. That's okay. We'll just continue on. So I'm going to delete that guy, and we will bring in our. Oh no! So it's all there. You can see. Yeah, we're good. So you can see we've got this nice decimated mesh in our scene, and what's really amazing about this V-Ray proxy is it still maintains all of our connections to the current scene's shaders for me, and it will automatically create this V-Ray mesh material for you. Just shrink that out of the way. Just so you know, the V-Ray mesh material will also get created if you're importing in a different proxy as well. And you can see that it grabbed those shader names for me, and now it's automatically connected the shaders that already exist in my scene to those slots. What's really great about this, though, is let's say I wanted to switch out my blue SSS. Let's open up our hypershade here. Let's say I wanted to switch out the blue subsurface to this more milky one. I can very easily do that just by drag and dropping these connections. I could also even go in and change this to a V-Ray blend material if I wanted to. All that carries through, which is great. And now you can see in your attribute editor, we do have a new connection here. So you can see we've got our V-Ray mesh node. So this is our node for our proxy. So this V-Ray mesh is the Maya node type for the proxy. And you can see if we scroll down, we have a lot of options here. So this one's not in the limbic, so we can ignore that one. But we do have some options. You can say first, if you want to show the whole mesh, we can do that. So this will take a quick second while it loads up that geo. So cool. You can see that all of that geo is actually inside of there. And so we can just turn that back off. And if let's say you have a ton of proxies in your scene, maybe even this is a little heavy, you can also just switch it to be a bounding box, which is great. As you scroll down, you can see there is this mesh visibility list. So V-Ray does store the objects inside, so you can you can see right now the list type is set to exclude. So if I just double click this, it will say, yes, I want to exclude liquid mesh 1 shape. I'll double click that and bring it back in. So let's do a quick render and see what this looks like. And I'm just going to save my scene file. So that was the proxy start. This one will just be proxy exported. Cool. And let's do a quick render. And you can see already as this is coming in that our actual mesh is being loaded in. You can see there's our metal shader, our subsurface is over here on the blue, and everything's looking really great. So everything is working as intended, and that's cool. So you may be asking why this is such a big deal at this point, but if you remember how dense that geometry really was, you're really going to be saving yourself a lot of headache when you're dealing with really large, dense groups of geometry. Going in and having your objects baked out to Vray proxies can be very helpful because you can go in and still have the ability to have large sets of geometry in your scene without having to actually view them in the viewport. So let's actually take a look at how this works. So what's really awesome about this is we can also have copies of this in our scene. So the Vray proxies are supported. They do support instances, like Maya instances, that is. So if I wanted to have 30 copies of this liquid in my scene, I can do that. So I'm going to scale this down a little bit. And let's go ahead and so let's do one duplicate special. And we'll just set this to instance. And let's just set the number of copies to 10. We'll move it over by 5 units. There we go. And now let's take all these same pieces again. And let's do the same thing, duplicate special, and we'll just make a nice grid of them. There we go. So you can see we've created a very, very dense set of geometry. So we've got 121 of these, and if you remember, we had about 900,000 faces in this. So we are looking at, give or take, maybe 120 million, maybe 100 million polygons, which can be pretty crazy. So let's see what this looks like if we render it out. Maybe we'll scale that group up a little bit again. Right in there. And in your render settings, by default, if you go to your RT engine, Vray Proxy checkbox is off. If you want your Vray Proxies to render in Vray RT, you do need to check that on. And so I'm just going to go ahead and save this file in case we crash. So here's our render. And I didn't actually pause the video or anything at all. It's literally that fast. And you can see that the Vray proxies are just loaded straight up and they're rendering right away. It's pretty amazing. So let's go ahead and delete all of these proxies. And just another, pretty cool thing you can start doing. Let's zero this guy back out. Let's just get all these, all of our proxies back where they were. It's cool. Maybe we'll scale that down a little bit. Right around there. So if you've ever seen this script SP Paint, this is a pretty nice little tool you can find online for free. It's pretty dated. It's kind of been replaced by XGen, but if you want to just really quickly kind of paint some instances around, it's pretty easy to do that. So you can see I can just set my target surface to paint on as my white cyc, and I can load up my proxy shape as my mesh geometry. I can set this to instance, align on surface, and I can just say, rotate 360 degrees in Y and do a random scale between, right now I'm at 0.4, so let's do 0.25 and 0.6. And now I can just paint. I can set my distance threshold a little bit lower too. So let's just paint. You can see we can just paint a bunch of these all over the place. You can even paint them on the wall back here. Do all sorts of crazy stuff. And so cool. Again, just really, I just blasted 200 sets of these, give or take. And again, I can go in and I can immediately just, I won't pause the video. You can see how quick it loads up. Oh, my screen was on the other side again. But, again, it just loads right up. The proxies are only loaded into memory one time, and V-Ray is able to properly render these out as instances, which is amazing. So let me do a regular render here, and you'll be able to see. So again, just started right up. It's building the light cache. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and we'll unpause it once it's done. So yeah, as you can see, we've just got a ton of these little liquid meshes all over the place, and that startup time on the render was very, very fast. You see the sample rate is pretty noisy, pretty red. I would definitely need to have a higher anti-aliasing. If you're ever doing a lot of geometry like this using Vray Proxies, definitely worth bringing up that you are going to want to potentially have a little bit more max subdivs. Just because when you are rendering such high amounts of polygons in your scene, a lot of that noise is going to start coming from your anti-aliasing rather than your other areas of your scene. So cool. So let's stay on the topic of these Vray Proxies here. I will just save this scene file out for you if you want to play around with it. This one will just be proxy instanced. There's an extra D on that. I apologize. So let's take a look, and I have a different scene file saved out here. So there's this proxy ABC sphere. And what we have, let's open up our outliner. There we go. You can see we've got, just to prove a point, I do have these spheres subdivided pretty intensely. But what I've done is created a little grid. So I've got 121 spheres again, 11 by 11. And what we can do is actually save out an alembic that maintains the instance information. So you can see these spheres. If I look in my outliner, they are instanced. They're all sharing the p-sphere shape 1 node. So if I press the down button on my keyboard, you can see they all are the same p-sphere shape 1. So keeping instances in your scene is always a very good idea if you're doing things like a forest or whatever. And so this is going to be definitely a very simplified version of this. But we can go in and so using our Alembic export feature, and again, I apologize, I'm in Maya 2014. There's definitely newer versions out, but I just have all my plugins working and everything, my scripts and everything work nice in 2014. So haven't converted everything to 2016 yet. But if we go to pipeline cache, export selection to Alembic, let's open up this option box. I'm just going to reset my settings so we can see what the defaults look like. And so what I like to do is set this to Agawa. Agawa is the newest format of Alembic, and I know it works well with instances. I like to turn on verbose. Verbose keeps the names of our objects, which is nice. UV, obviously, and lastly, world space, which ensures that all of our objects, if they had maybe a hierarchy of group nodes animating them or whatever, they will be written out into their world space. So I've only got a single frame here, so I can just go to start end, and I can just do one frame. There we go. And I can just say export selection. And I actually already have one. This is my instance test.abc. So I'm just going to export that and overwrite it. And if we look now, let me go over to this I wanted to show you what these file sizes look like, which is very interesting. So what we've got, instance test, that's what I just wrote out. That's 236 kilobytes. And that's all of the spheres together in one single file. Single sphere is one sphere exported out, which is 139 kilobytes. So you can see there's actually, 121 spheres packed into this. So what you're looking at is basically the one piece of geometry and then all the transform information, which brings us up there. A single OBJ is actually larger than a single sphere on Alembic. The Agawa format of Alembic really does a nice job compressing stuff down. And just as a separate example, I did select 6 individual spheres and exported them out, and that was already 2.1 megabytes. So if you multiply these values that are these data set numbers by much larger pieces of geometry than my one single sphere with 2,500 faces, imagine if that sphere represented an entire building or a tree that was 500,000 faces. You immediately start saving huge amounts of hard drive space and computation time and memory. You'll actually be creating scene files that you would never be able to create at all. A lot of my day-to-day production work actually involves complex problem solving with this type of stuff where we have really massive data sets and we have to find ways to render them effectively. And this is one method to that. So let's see how this works. So I'm just going to go ahead and hide this. And I'm going to bring in that Alembic. I'm just going to say import proxy. So this import proxy menu comes up and you can see we've got single file. I'm just going to name it sphere array. That's kind of what we got. And I'm going to go over here and I'm just going to grab my instance test.abc. We'll import that. Cool. Let's hit create. And you can notice that because I'm loading in an Alembic, since Vray didn't actually export this mesh, we don't have the really nicely put together proxy shape. So you can see instead we just have some individual triangles of that mesh. I am still able to go back in and say show whole mesh if I want to, and it'll load in all of them. If you have a really, really dense set of instances, it may not even ever be a good idea to click that show whole mesh button. You may just want to keep it like this. So Vray does go in and automatically create my Vray mesh material. In this case, though, the Vray mesh material is a little bit different because we have a Vray, shader slot for every single object in my scene. I also, because they're all sharing the same shape node, this is probably not the best example that I am just grabbing. I wouldn't totally easily be able to tell what was what in this situation. But I can always go in and just switch this out for a regular Vray material. So because they are instanced and I know that they're going to be using the same material, I can just do this. So let's make them all, just make them all, I guess, just kind of whatever, blue kind of thing. A little bit of reflection, a little bit of reflection glossiness as well. It's a little bit of specular. And let's click back over to my sphere array here. You can also see that we still have object IDs through all of this, and we have our single object name. Lastly, if we go to our Alembic proxy properties, you can actually see, because Alembic supports curves, you can export hair in this file format. You can export particles into an Alembic format. You can also even choose to subdivide these meshes a little bit if you wanted to. A little bit of warning though, because I have instances in this, off the top of my head, I'm not totally sure how that would react with instances. For me, it's usually a good rule of thumb that the geo always gets exported in its final state and it's just ready to be rendered. That's kind of how I work, but this is a new feature and I have it may be pretty cool to use. So let's go ahead and check this out. So let's create a light just for our little simple scene here. let's go ahead, open up our render settings. Vray Proxy is already turned on. I'm going to save this file, and we'll just say exported. And that, I, again, didn't even pause the video, just totally like turned right on. So if I IPR that, you can see if I hit stop here, well, let's just IPR that again. It literally just turns right on. That was me snapping my fingers. So let's turn our quick LUT on. You can see I've got simple, just 1D LUT to kind of even this out. But yeah, pretty amazing how fast that can be. Still reacting very, very responsively. And maybe we'll go ahead and make this a little bit crazier even. So because this is still a regular Maya shape node connected to a V-Ray mesh node, I can actually instance this as well. So again, I can pull up something like SP Paint. I could instance these across particles. You can do all sorts of cool stuff with this. So let's make my target surface that. We'll select my Vray Proxy node, my V-Ray mesh here. So there's my sphere array. That'll be my brush geometry. Let's rotate 360 degrees. We can scale this all over the place. We'll say 0.25 to 1. And now I can just paint this. So we'll make it really, really dense here. So I don't know how many we just made, a ton. We'll hide that original one here. There we go. So again, 200 of them. And I will save my file, IPR this, and let's see what we get. It is taking a little bit longer to calculate that now. As I feared, my Maya crashed. This kind of happened randomly. Anyways, you can see it is all connected up. We've got a bunch of these sphere proxies that have just kind of been painted. And if I just render this out, if I re-click my IPR here, you can see it pop right in. It loads up very, very quickly. Pretty amazing. So you've got that all set for you. I could even go in here if I wanted to, and I can select a different set of them. And I could assign a new material to only that piece. So if I wanted to, I can make that one in the background there bright red. You can get it to, there you go. So there's those spheres back there. It's a very versatile tool. It's really awesome as well that the Vray Proxies do accept instances via the Alembic format as well. So let's go back and just kind of see this in action a little bit. So let's open up that cactus. Here we are. So you can see that these are actually V-Ray meshes, proxies, in the scene that we were working on for the single object properties demo. And the way these were created was I imported an alembic of some cacti. So let me grab these real quick. So you can see we can just grab any of them here. So here's our cactus. And here's our geometry, which comes in pretty small. We can scale it up. This geometry does, this alembic, I actually chose to go ahead and just assign my materials to it first. But I brought that in, exported the Vray proxy, and you can see now, even with this desert scene here, I could go in and do some other kind of cool stuff, like paint some additional instances around, whatever, and you can see that my actual face count in the scene is very, very low. Only 32,000 at the moment. So I guess this is as close as a production example as we kind of have right now, but you can definitely see how useful this could be. So, again, we can just go in and make that our target surface. We can grab each proxy, make them our brush geometry, and it'll randomly assign each one. And now I can go in and randomly scale these around, maybe a little bit less than that, 0.8. Rotate them. And now I can go ahead and, I can just place individual ones. And now if I was to go in and render that back out again, and let's just turn off, I think we've got some volumetric fog in here. So let's turn off that environment volume. And now I can go ahead and we'll just save this scene real quick for you. As one last one, we'll just call it Proxy Cacti. There we go. Let's IPR that. And so these are larger meshes. So I wanted to kind of show the speed difference here, but really still not that bad. That loaded up in about 10 seconds. And, I'm not using a supercomputer for this. This is just my home machine that I'm using with a single processor. It's fairly up to date, but it's by no means crazy. You can see we're now rendering really a pretty phenomenal amount of geometry. So, if I was to kind of zoom in here, you can see that each of these cacti do still have a full set of spines, pretty heavy duty in the way of geometry count. This is you're probably looking at 100 million, 50 million polygons, and it's able to load up and render in no time at all. So, a little bit more of a production example in this situation where we have a high density mesh. We're able to replicate it all over the place. Means I kind of messed up my groups here, so the proxies are all in these separate SP Paint groups, but hopefully that does help in terms of a little bit more real world case scenario. So I'll just save this file out for you, and you can kind of play around with that as well. And that's really it. That's kind of the power of these Vray proxies. And also you'll be surprised. As far as geometry goes, Maya will crap out before Vray will, which makes sense too, because Maya is actively trying to draw this stuff on your graphics card, whereas Vray is just able to load it into memory and render it. So you may actually find a lot of benefit as you're working. If you finalize a piece of geometry, kick it out. If it's high res, you can kick it out as a Vray proxy. So, have some fun with them. They're definitely pretty cool. And enjoy yourself.